Last night I spent some time thinking about how I might describe this bill to someone who was hearing about it for the first time, to someone perhaps who had no knowledge of our youth justice system, of political agendas, of the issues we face in New Zealand. And I would tell them, and how I would tell them what we were doing here today. Well, I would probably start with this. Our youth justice system, as it is now, is unique, and something we should be proud of. It's a system that acknowledges that young people should be treated differently, that for the most part, we have an opportunity to turn people's lives around. It's a system that until now, at least, was internationally respected. But this bill and the policy which surrounds it undermines our existing system. I'd like to take this opportunity to go through the most significant elements of the bill. In fact, I want to focus mostly just on two. But first, my thanks to all those who participated in the Select Committee, practitioners, academics, youth leaders, community organisations. They all gave up their time to present to the Select Committee people with more hands-on knowledge than ourselves, and they undoubtedly told us how it is. There were two parts that stood out for me in particular as a member of that Select Committee. First, the government's decision to enable proceedings to be commenced in the youth court against children aged 12 or 13 years who are alleged to have committed specified offences. It's a point that's been well canvassed in this House this evening. And as my colleague, the Honourable Annette King, has already pointed out, the Chief Judge of the Youth Court said it best when he stated this part of the bill constitutes, and I quote, the most fundamental change to the system since its inception in 1989. And why? Why would we make such a significant move, such a fundamental change? I have to be honest and say that after a full Select Committee process, I'm still none the wiser, and nor were submitters. If a child commits the worst offences in our law books, they can already be sent to our adult courts. And the rest? Well, there is no denying that if a child, and I repeat that, a child, a 12 or 13-year-old is committing the kinds of crimes that the government has identified, there are issues going on in that child's home and that child's life. The best court we have in New Zealand to deal with not just that child, but to assist that family is our family court. Nothing the government has proposed has convinced me otherwise. And again, Andrew Beecroft noted that, quote, there is real concern by youth court judges that the court will be assuming responsibility for the worst child offenders who by definition will have the most serious care and protection issues, yet the youth court will not have the necessary statutory ammunition to deal with the inevitable care and protection issues at the root of the offending. He did not talk in that statement about issues around streamlining, about being inundated with young people. He talked about their inability with the statutory powers they have to deal with those young people. And if at the heart of the issue, as the chair of the Select Committee has pointed out, was the desire to give judges the right kinds of powers, why then in the first instance did the government not look at giving greater powers to the family court? And we proposed this to the chief youth court judge, who said that that would have been a much more elegant solution than the fundamental change we see before us today. Labor refuses to support an amendment, a fundamental change that the government cannot justify, has no evidence for, and undermines our system. Perhaps more telling, though, was the fact that the most commonly raised and discussed element of the bill was something that wasn't even really a formal part of the primary legislation. Everyone, as the chair of the Select Committee has pointed out, had a view on the government's so-called boot camps. I call them so-called because it was in fact the Prime Minister who first coined and referred to the military element of these camps so strongly. And almost unanimously, the view of submitters was negative. Submitters told us that these methods have tried and failed in New Zealand. In fact, we've heard over and over that those who graduated in the early version of these camps' corrective training had a 92% reoffending rate. 92%. And if that wasn't enough, there were plenty of other jurisdictions that have tried and failed also. But the government members continually, and I acknowledge this, they continually maintained during submissions that this program would be different. It wasn't the same as corrective training. This program would work intensively with young people, focus on providing good role models, and take a wraparound approach. It was presented as if it were a completely new idea. Well, it's not. And if this is truly what the national government is aiming to create, then we already have it. It was called Te Hurihanga. And for the listeners who may not have heard of this program before, it was established several years ago by Phil Goff and Judge Carolyn Henwood. It was small, intensive, and took on the worst offenders in Hamilton and the surrounding area. At first, we must all acknowledge, it was controversial. Some local Hamiltonians didn't want it, but that was then, and this is now. I don't need to pass judgment on this MST-based program operated by the Youth Horizons Trust. It has been evaluated favourably by a reviewer, and that review is now publicly available. But more importantly, it has been judged by local police officers, family and friends of those in the program, and the local community. It has been described, I say to the member from Hamilton West who's with us, it has been described as a godsend, filled with talented and skilled staff, and the reason that offending has dropped by 82% by those who have participated. And it has even now got the buy-in of some of its biggest opponents. Let me be clear and honest. In youth justice, success rates are low and tough, and not just here, but everywhere in the world. But Te Hurihanga was making gains, and for less than it would have cost to imprison someone for just a few years. Without this program, many of these young men would have been facing that as soon as they hit their 17th birthday. Mr. Speaker, last week the government announced that they would close Te Hurihanga, and I am left with one big question. If this is not the model the government wants to follow, as they describe, what is? I fear that the answer is closer to the boot camp model, despite their denial, the failed model the government has tried to distance itself from. I fear that the government's Fresh Start program, rather than being the full wraparound it describes, is based on the idea of a short, sharp shock, as my colleague from the Māori Party described. Short-term programs that churn young offenders through with little acknowledgement of the hard and difficult truth that the methods that work take time, they take work, not just with the young person but their family. They take experienced staff, and inevitably they take money. Mr. Speaker, ultimately, gains in youth justice take political courage. In a society where a lock and throw mentality is popular, investing in early intervention programs that already exist may not make for a sexy headline, nor does an evidence base, acronyms like MST or FTT, or following the recommendations of expert advisory groups. But that, Mr. Speaker, would have been the right thing to do. It's time for some political courage. For a brief period, as my colleague Leanne Dalziel pointed out, I thought Simon Powell might have been capable of it. He launched the Drivers of Crime conference. He committed himself to listening and addressing the precursors of crime and invest in them. He heard the things that we've all been told over and over. Get a group of young offenders in a room and you'll find something common in all of their backgrounds, whether it be poverty, family violence, lack of engagement in education, or drugs and alcohol. We know the problems, we just need to invest in the answers. I lost faith in this government's desire to do that last week when they closed Te Hurihanga. It is the only measure, if the only measure for early intervention for this government is something that is cheap, that is truly short-sighted. There is nothing that costs this country more than the intangible cost of a victim, a family that has lost a loved one to crime or as a consequence of it, and a wasted life behind bars. Nothing except perhaps the absence of political courage.